Okay, everyone, welcome back. We're getting started right on the dot. We have a lot of material to cover, so thank you for coming back. Let's see here. So today's topic, as you know, is Islamic Rationalism, Defenders of Reason in Islam. I warn you that some people would want to rate this rated H for haram. And I say that just because these are the kind of things in our tradition, Islamic rationalism and philosophy, that certain segments of our society don't want you to know about. So this is going to be a very intense class today, but if you stick around, I think you will start to understand kind of the larger debates that are going on in the Islamic world even today. Some quick housekeeping. I've been overwhelmed by the response to this class. I really thought we would have whittled down the students by now. I thought people would drop out, but really I continue to get people wanting to join the class. Thank you so much. I think that's a testament not only to how amazingly handsome I am, sorry, I hear my wife groaning in the back, but really that this is kind of material I think that people want to hear about, these kind of gems in our Islamic tradition that we've been kind of distanced and alienated from. So thank you for joining me on this journey. So I do get emails about wanting to join or messages about joining the class. First and foremost, you can join our Google Classroom. That's the code right there. And I think the moderator will put the code back in as well as the link in the chat. Our Zoom class is full, so please join us on YouTube and the link is right there as well. You can email me and I can see if we can join you to the Zoom class, but I think it really is full. On that note, I did want to welcome our YouTube and Facebook Live students. Thank you for joining us. Please ask questions there and I will try to answer them. The moderator will forward those questions to me. I apologize, last time I did miss some questions. There was a mix up on my end of looking at the wrong thread, but this time I'll try to be a little bit better with that. We will give priority to Zoom students just because they're registered, and I do appreciate that you're here physically on Zoom. On that note, please, video questions, please. Let's encourage that. Use the raise hand function, notify the moderator, wave your hands, whatever you need to do. Let's try to encourage this. And I know I need to be the one who kind of prompts for this. So I do want to get that kind of interaction going to make it a little bit more like a classroom. So please don't be shy, ask video questions. The golden rule, of course, of netiquette, when not speaking, please mute yourself to prevent background noise. The other point is, we've been talking about kind of expanding what we think is our religious thought from an intra-Islamic viewpoint. We're looking at other trends of Islamic thought. We looked at Sufism, Shiism, things that you may not have considered in the past. I want you to kind of expand your thinking a little bit even further and think about faith traditions outside of Islam. Those can actually help you inform your own religious thinking. On that note, I did want you to consider subscribing to the South Coast Interfaith Council. My sister, Sarah Dean, who is the moderator for this class, is instrumental in this. This is a link that you can go to. I'll have the moderator put that link there for you. But this is a very interesting YouTube to join. They talk about other faith traditions and in the context of social justice. So I've been really impressed by this. As always, continue to email me feedback. We're more than halfway done with this course. So, but we'll continue to evolve and improve. Thank you very much. All right, so let's begin. So we've already talked about the prophetic period shortly thereafter. What happens is the Muslims expand, and they expand quite rapidly. As they expand, they absorb elements of the Byzantine Empire, which is the Roman Empire, to the west, and the Sasanian or the Persian Empire to the east. Now, we sometimes just focus on military history, but there's actually something quite more profound than that, which is intellectual history. As Muslims expand into these regions, they start absorbing the knowledge from these civilizations and societies. There's certain elements of Islamic society who want to have nothing to do with it. It's all non-Muslim, kafir, haram, that kind of thing. But there's multiple elements within the Islamic fold who want to embrace these outside traditions of knowledge, the Greek science that's coming from the West, and then on the Persian side as well, which from the Persian side, you're getting traditions coming all the way from Indian history as well. There are elements within the Islamic tradition, Islamic community, who want to consolidate this knowledge and to improve and build upon it. And this will create the Islamic golden age, which we'll talk about. It's in this context that we have the rise of what's called Kalam. Kalam is translated often as theology, and the science is Ilm al-Kalam. I've recently heard from various scholars, including my good friend, Professor Khalil Andani, that perhaps we should think of theology as something more expansive than just Kalam. So I often do translate it as Kalam as theology, but theology is something wider as well. The other thing is that Kalam encompasses not just theology, but also philosophy. But it is kind of a shorthand that I use, that Kalam means theology. Kalam linguistically comes from the word speech, and there are different theories about why that is. One of the reasons is that these theological debates happen because Muslims are being exposed to the outside civilizations, non-Muslim groups. You're having intra and inter-Muslim discussions, and that's, again, why I hinted towards that South Coast Interfaith YouTube, that it's all relevant to this. This is kind of the environment the early Muslims are in, and they're having these intra and interfaith dialogues and discourses. And so they were known as people who kind of discoursed or involved in speech. And so this is one of the reasons why it could be that theology could be, the word kalam came to be used. The other reason is that one of the key disputes in this early period has to do with God's speech, or kalam. So that's another possibility, and we're going to talk about that in this lecture. So theology specifically refers to creedal belief or theology. And again, it was in the context of this intra and interfaith dialogue. The people who engaged in this were known as kalam scholars, which in Arabic is mutakallimun. And this differentiates them from the jurists, or the fuqaha, the faqirs. And the mutakallimun consist of two major groups. One are the Mu'tazilis. These I translate as the rationalists, and the Asharis, which can be translated as the semi-rationalists. The Ashari group is going to become what we commonly consider Islamic orthodoxy today. Now, these are, again, just shorthand translations of Mu'tazilis as rationalists and Asharis as orthodoxy. They're problematic. Many scholars would not want to use this. This is just a shorthand that I use, especially when I'm talking in some semi-formal and non-academic setting. Now, the mutakallimun, the kalam scholars, the people who are engaging in these theological disputes and debates, they're opposed by the traditionalists or the traditionists, the Ahl al-Hadith. We talked about this group in lecture 2. This is kind of, we can think of it as, if the Asharis become orthodoxy, the Ahl al-Hadith, some scholars have used the word uber-orthodoxy or ultra-orthodoxy. And we'll see that these two groups, the Asharis and the traditionalists, are going to be competing for the claim of orthodoxy. I know that's very complicated, but please stick with me here. So there are basically two trends in early Islam that we see. First are the people of opinion or reasoned opinion, if you're kind of sympathetic to them, or speculative opinion, if you're not sympathetic to them. Kind of speculative has that kind of negative connotation. These are the rationalists. And then the other element you have is that Ahl al-Hadith, the people of tradition, really textual tradition. These are the people who are focusing on text and law, and these are the traditionalists or the traditionists. And that's really a focus on hadith. So I need to differentiate between two terms here, fiqh and kalam. So fiqh, we said, that's what the fuqaha do. That's jurisprudence or Islamic law. That's related to Sharia. That answers the question, what do you do? Kalam, on the other hand, is done by the mutakallimun or the kalam scholars. That's theology. That's related to creedal belief or akidah. And that is related to what do you believe? So the way you can think of it is, if you wanted to ask, is certain food haram or halal, is that fiqh or is that kalam? That's fiqh. That has to do with jurisprudence. If you wanted to ask the question, do non-Muslims go to paradise or do they go to hell? That's a question about theology, or that would be related to akidah and come under the ambit of kalam. All right. Again, very complicated. We're going to try to simplify. So we talked about the legal schools, which are the fiqh schools. these are going to be related to the Kalam schools. So they're not only fiqh madhabs or schools, they're also Kalam schools or madhabs. So we have the Hanbalis, and I've tried to make this easy and I've related them to the four Ninja Turtles. That's how I think about the four schools. So the Hanbalis, they're kind of Leonardo. They're associated with Ahl al-Hadith. They're the traditionalists. They see themselves as the leaders of Sunni orthodoxy. They are the uber orthodoxy, you can say. The Malikis, they're Michelangelo. They're the lived tradition. The Hanafis are Donatello. They're associated with the Ahl al-Rai, the Mu'tazilis. They're the rationalist school of thoughts. They're always thinking like, Donatello. Finally, you have the Shafa'is. Remember, we talked about how Imam Shafi'i, he's the one who did the synthesis between the three schools. And that synthesis will really become the dominant trend in Islamic jurisprudential thought. So he does favor the Ahl al-Hadith. He basically uses some rationalism and in the ends of traditionalism. So you see that there's the Hanbali and the Shafi'is who are traditionalists, and the Hanafis are really rationalists. Eventually, all of the four schools will coalesce. They'll kind of come together, and they will all become pretty traditionalist. And the difference between them will not be as wide as time progresses. So these are the four legal schools, the madhahib, the madhabs that you've heard of. But they're also doctrinal or kalam schools. And it gets really confusing because when we talk about kalam schools, we also use the word Hanbalis. So the Hanbali school is a fiqh school, but it's also used as a shorthand for a kalam school. Now, some people will differentiate and use the word athari, which is like textual school, but really we use the word Hanbalis. So Hanbalis refers to a madhab in the legal school, in the legal way, but also this kalam school. And they are traditionalists, they're textualists. Their opponents would call them literalists. It's important to keep in mind that technically they're not really a kalam school. They actually oppose kalam. They think kalam is a bid'ah. It's a innovation, a blameworthy innovation. And they're saying that, look, you're discoursing with these non-Muslim groups. You're introducing all sorts of innovations into religion. The prophets and the early Muslims did not deal with these topics. And these topics are really leading you astray. You should just follow the Quran and really the Hadith. That's really what you should follow and just ignore all of these other topics. Now, in reality and in practice, the Hanbalis will engage in these discourses, even though they're opposed to Kalam. In their debates with the Mutakallimun, they themselves will engage in theological debate. And some of it can be quite sophisticated. But at least early on, it's not quite that way. And they'll kind of ignore these Kalam discourses or have kind of inconsistent views. And we'll kind of hint at that later. Now, the first real theological school of Islam are the Mu'tazilis, which I have translated with the shorthand of rationalists. These were often Hanafis at this time. Their opponents would call them the Qadris, and we'll talk about what that is, but that's kind of a pejorative term for them. And Mu'tazili is also kind of a pejorative term, but they take it on. We'll talk about that. Now, and then you have the Ash'aris, who are the semi-rationalists. They are people who take they believe that kalam is important. Reason should be used in the service of the textual tradition only. And so these become the semi-rationalists. They emerge into the Islamic orthodoxy. Today, this is what you're taught at Al-Azhar University. There's also the Maturidis. We're not going to talk about the Maturidis. Really, the Maturidis and the Ash'aris, they kind of come close to each other, and the difference is minimal. Early on, the Maturidis are kind of a midway. If the Ash'aris are a midway point between the Hanbalis and the Mu'tazilis, the Maturidis are a midway point between the Mu'tazilis and the Ash'aris. But bottom line is, we're just going to talk about the Ash'aris. And you'll see this bias in the Western Academy. I'm kind of reproducing it, that really we just focus on the Ash'aris. All very confusing, I know, but there are basically three groups here that are important. One is the Hanbalis. They're kind of the uber orthodoxy. Two is the Ash'aris. They become the dominant group. That's the kind of Islamic orthodoxy that we think of. And then they're the Islamic rationalists that are the Mu'tazilis. So let's go over that real quick again, because I know that's confusing, but it's really important that we go over this. You need to understand this if you want to understand current debates. And we will give examples of their beliefs and thoughts. This is what the whole lecture will be about. So Hanbalis, they are kind of the literal textualists. They are Ahl al-Hadith. They oppose Kalam or speculative theology. Now they use the word speculative because they think it's something blameworthy. They say just follow the Quran, especially the Hadiths. And you should read these sources literally or fairly literally. There is going to be a Zahiri school, which is even more literalist than them. But we're not going to talk about that group a lot. The Hanbalis, at least by their opponents, would be considered literalists. They will at least say, hey, we follow the apparent and obvious meaning of the text, and we don't go beyond that. And so they are kind of represented here by the Ninja Turtle Leonardo in my mind. He's the leader. He's kind of fierce looking, kind of grumpy a little bit, trying to get all the other Ninja Turtles in line. Then you have the Mu'tazilis. They're the rationalists. They're the first theological or Kalam school of Islam. Now that's kind of interesting, and I'm going to talk about this. They're the first school. So if you wanted to say what's orthodoxy, what's heterodoxy, well, I mean, many people try to say that the Mu'tazilis are this kind of random mutation in Islamic history, but that's not really the case. For the first 200 years of Islam, they were actually a major theological group, and they were in fact the first. And so they're represented by Donatello. They're kind of nerdy, they're thinking all the time. The Mu'tazilis were arguably also the first philosophers of Islam. So this is a view by Professor Peter Adamson. I agree, and we see that there is this fuzzy line between theology and philosophy. We'll talk about this next class as well when we specifically focus on the Islamic philosophers. So they originated in Basra. They are their founder, quote unquote. Again, we see in the tradition that all groups, especially if they're considered later heretical, they're kind of attributed to just one figure. And then there's also this fantastic story that's associated with the founding. We'll talk about that story. But Wasil ibn Atta, he is the founder, and that's all the way in the early 2nd century, 131 AH. Now the Mu'tazili school will have a Basran and a Baghdad school, but these will eventually merge together. Now this word Mu'tazila, where does it come from? It's kind of a strange word. It comes from the Arabic word to withdraw or separate from. And the reason is apparently this early figure was in this study circle, and he, over a religious debate that we're going to talk about later on, he kind of withdrew from that group and then went off and founded his own quote unquote deviant school of thought. From that, the Mu'tazilis were given this name of Mu'tazilis, which means seceders, or people who withdraw from the community. Now, certain Mu'tazilis themselves will say, no, that's not what Mu'tazili means. It actually means that we withdraw from the fitna that was created during the civil war and Uthman's time. So they kind of put a positive spin on it. Now, they themselves, the Mu'tazilis themselves, would not use the term Mu'tazili, at least early on. They call themselves Ahl al-Tawheed wal-Adl, the people of divine unity and justice. That was based on their belief that God is one and he is just. That summarizes their entire doctrinal worldview. That's a much more positive connotation. Everybody would want to be called the people of divine unity and justice. That's a much more positive term to be used. Now, the third group are the Asharis that we talked about. They're the semi-rationalists. They're what emerged to become orthodoxy. They take the tools of rationalism by the Mu'tazilis, and then they kind of use them to defend what they're calling kind of Sunni orthodoxy. So they were founded by Abul Hasan al-Ashari. Look at the death date, 324 AH. That's more than 100 years after the supposed founder of Mu'tazilism. And this is Islamic orthodoxy. So again, there's this idea of kind of back projecting Islamic orthodoxy onto the early moment, the founding moment of Islamic history. We see that this is kind of problematic if you're studying this from an academic historical perspective. What's interesting as well, that he himself, the founder of Asharism, which again becomes Islamic orthodoxy, was himself a Mu'tazili. He was a student of this major Mu'tazili scholar, but then he himself broke away to form what he called a middle way option between rationalism and traditionalism. And by the way, there's this story of How he breaks away, it's all based on dreams that he gets from the prophet who commands him to do this. So we see that this idea of ilham, or divine inspiration, actually created Islamic orthodoxy. Or at least it's one of the founding myths or narratives of Islamic orthodoxy. Now, that's all extremely confusing, and you're like, please stop filling my brain with all of these names, and why is this important? It's extremely important because it helps you understand the modern period, the debates that happen in the modern period. These are completely, or almost completely, analogous. The Hanbalis, the early Hanbalis, are represented today by the Salafis or the Wahhabis. Think Saudi Arabia. The Ash'aris are what we consider now the quote-unquote mainstream Islam of the ulama, or the religious clerics. Think Al-Azhar University. And the Mu'tazilis were kind of resuscitated by the Islamic modernists. Think Sir Sayyid and Muhammad Abdu. Think Aligarh, the Aligarh movement. These three schools, these three general trends continue to battle each other in the present day. That's why it's important to understand these three groups in Islamic history. All right, very confusing, I know. We're going to go through these three schools. We're going to focus on this course on the Mu'tazilis, the Islamic rationalists, but we need to put them in conversation with the Hanbalis, which is the uber orthodoxy, remember, and then the Ash'aris, which become Islamic orthodoxy. Now, we called this lecture The Defenders of Reason because of the Mu'tazilis. That's how they saw themselves, and that's the major book that I used was called Defenders of Reason in Islam. Meanwhile, the Hanbalis, as we saw in lecture 2, early Sunni Islam, came to view reason with suspicion. And you may have grown up with this belief yourself, that basically your aql, your human reason, is something that's dangerous. It will lead you astray. So we see, and this is a fatwa by, or a source written by the Grand Imam of Makkah. This is a present day Imam. You see that he writes in this article the dangers of reason. Reason is equated with capricious whims. It's a threat to the Islamic nation. It has disastrous consequences if you follow it. And you really need to submit your reason below, much below the holy texts. It is something that you just use minimally. It's something that you should stay away from. And then they quote Ibn Taymiyyah, who basically said, and he was a medieval Islamic scholar, who basically said that the early Muslims would reject any argument which opposes the Quran, and using your own opinion, taste, rationality, and analogical thinking, personal sentiments, all of that is something very negative. And you may have grown up with this belief. I certainly did. And you see again that they're basically cautioning. In the past, they would caution against the Mu'tazilis, and in the present, they're cautioning against the Islamic modernists who take up this mantle of reason. These are people who have erred in their mind because they privilege aql over naql, that is, reason over text. Now, so that's the Hanbalis. What about the Mu'tazilis? They embrace human reason as God-given and good. It is, in their minds, actually, the primary grace given by God, even before revelation. In fact, their first principle is that it is incumbent upon all human beings to exercise speculative reason, an-nazar, in order to know God. And the rest of what we know about religion can't even be known until we first rationally arrive at the idea that there is a God. So religion, in their viewpoint, is based on reason. Religion, after all, in their argument, is based on the following. Number one, the fact that we know God exists using our human reason to reflect upon the reality around us, that is, God's providential grace. What they're saying is that we look outside in the world and we see that there's this beauty and wisdom in the world, and that leads us to a belief in God. And then there's the ethical obligation, also known by human reason, to thank one's benefactor. That is, you look outside the world, you look at your own blessings that you've been given in this world, and based on human reason, you know that you need to thank whoever gave all these blessings to you. So you're using your human reason to arrive at belief in God. And that's what makes you be grateful to God and then obey God as well. And they would cite various verses of the Quran about human reason. And again, the Hanbalis would quote other verses about obedience to God, but the Mu'tazilis are quoting the verses that seem to put a positive light on human reason. The Quran, in their viewpoint, repeatedly calls on human beings to look within themselves and at the world around them to reflect upon God's beauty, wisdom, and providential grace. And here's one sample verse, for example, and there are dozens and dozens of them. God it is who raised the heavens and made the sun and the moon subservient, each running for a term appointed. He it is who spread out the earth and placed therein firm mountains and streams, and of every kind of fruit he placed therein 2 kinds. He causes the night to cover the day. Truly, in that are signs for a people who think. And the Quran condemns those who do not use reason or think. Truly, the worst of beasts in the sight of God are the deaf and the dumb, who do not use reason. La ya'kulun. So they actually say, now, it is not true that the Mu'tazilis place reason above revelation. In fact, they believe in taking these two things hand in hand, reason and revelation. As we'll see next week or next class, the Islamic philosophers can be said to put reason above revelation. So that's how you can kind of think of it. The Islamic philosophers will put reason above revelation. The Mu'tazilis, the Islamic rationalists, will put them side by side. They go hand in hand. And the Hanbalis and Islamic orthodoxy will place reason below revelation. That's how you can kind of think of it. Now, having said that, all of the mutakallimun, the Kalam scholars, will say that reason is prior to revelation. Why? Because you need to arrive at revelation through human reason. Reason has priority because you first need to reason your way to God, belief in the prophethood of Muhammad, and the sacredness of the Quran. They point out that it would be circular logic to claim that we believe in God because the Quran tells us so. You would see some early Hanbalis saying this, that look, we believe in God because the Quran tells us to believe in God. But that is really circular and not very sophisticated logic. So keep in mind, Islamic rationalists and philosophers were debating with not just other Muslims, but also Christians, Jews, and even atheist materialists. So they couldn't just say, look, the Quran tells us these things. No, they would have to use reason, human reason to debate with these people and come to common ground. And to even arrive at the Quran and Islam, you had to use human reason. They would ground belief in God in certain Quranic cosmological or teleological arguments for the existence of God. For example, the Quran says, were they created by nothing, or were they the creators of themselves? The Quran denies that the universe could have been created out of mere coincidence or sudfa. In a large part of the Quran is a teleological argument for the existence of God. This is kind of, today we kind of take this as the watchman argument for God, which is not taken that seriously anymore, but it has been resuscitated by what's called the fine-tuning argument for the existence of God, which is now taken much more seriously. But keep in mind that these are not, the Quran, again, like I said, it's not a book of law, and it's not a book of theology. The Quran is a book that's meant to give spiritual guidance, salvational guidance to humankind. So these are, the way the Quran frames them is not as a tight, rational, theological or philosophical argument, but rather they are more hortatory arguments meant to instill wonder and amazement in the individual. That's the purpose of the Quran. But the mutakallimun, the rational theologians, they are going to take these arguments, these kind of that are kind of signaled in the Quran, and they're going to flesh them out and formalize them. One of the most, one of the key arguments, which they would consider the mother of proofs, is what's now called the Kalam cosmological argument. It has been kind of resuscitated by Professor William Lane Craig. He's a Christian theologian, but he's kind of popularized the Kalam cosmological argument. And this was put forward by Imam Ghazali, or he wasn't the one who completely originated it, but he did popularize it. This is the words of Imam Ghazali. This is the basic outlines of this argument. One, every being which begins to exist has a cause. The world is a being which begins. Therefore, it possesses a cause for its beginning. This is kind of the Kalam cosmological argument in a nutshell. It doesn't allow you to arrive at God, but it is a starting point. And then the Kalam theologians will flesh this out even more and say this will get you enough to really get to a close approximation of the Abrahamic God. And you can click on that link. I'm going to post the notes in the Google Classroom so you can watch that video, but it's a short clip where William Lane Craig talks about the Kalam cosmological argument, and it is fairly strong and robust. Professor Craig has debated atheists, and he gives them a good run for their money. So do check that out. Now, there was what I would consider an even stronger argument. If that was the mother of all proofs, I would say this is the Bap, or the father of all proofs. This is Ibn Sina's or Avicenna's argument from Contingency. Ibn Sina was an Islamic philosopher. The West knows him as Avicenna. We're going to talk about him next class. He was the most profound and famous Islamic philosopher. He made this argument from Contingency. What's interesting about this is that it's not premised on the idea of a temporal universe. In fact, Avicenna himself believed that the universe was eternal. This argument was taken up by major Muslim thinkers, both by philosophers and theologians alike. It was also taken up by Western thinkers through St. Thomas Aquinas and reformulated by Leibniz in the 18th century. So I contend that whereas the Kalam cosmological argument may be more intuitive, that is, it's easier to understand, Avicenna's argument from Contingency is stronger and arguably the strongest rational proof for the existence of God. It is very complicated, and I'm not able to go through either of these two arguments today, but I would point you to Professor Khalil Andani's lecture, where he gives a simple but very accurate representation of Avicenna's argument for the existence of God. That's the YouTube link. I'll put these in the notes. I strongly recommend you to watch this video. All of this points to the fact that belief in God is something reasonable. And this is an argument that goes back many hundreds of years. Again, they're having these debates not only with non-Muslims, but also with atheists. And I think that holds true to this day. I did want to point you to this video clip by Hamza Yusuf, just from 44 to 149, where basically Hamza Yusuf, I think he does a fair job. This is a present day Islamic scholar, where he basically says, look, most of these people who are really the strongest in their atheism, not all of them, but the people who are kind of pushing it on people and kind of portraying that religious and theistic people are kind of backward and primitive, many of them have not read any of the major thinkers and the sophisticated thinkers of that talk about these arguments for the existence of God. So I do want you to watch that quick video. Now, of course, this is not to say that there aren't powerful arguments against the belief in God. In fact, on my view, the portrayal of atheists by theists as irrational or stupid, or vice versa, you see this done by both sides, is usually, in my mind, done by non-serious persons who do not read widely or reflect deeply on this matter. It is quite reasonable to hold a belief in God, and it is quite reasonable to disbelieve in God. I think these are reasonable beliefs to have. I, of course, side on the theistic side, but I'm not going to portray someone on the other side as irrational or stupid. Ultimately, I do think Ghazali and Avicenna's arguments answer the ultimate question, which I think atheists do have a hard time answering. Why is there something rather than nothing? I think this is the ultimate question. I don't think atheists can give a good answer to this. They might resign themselves to that there's no way to answer that question, which is reasonable. You know, one famous Western philosopher did say that the universe is just a brute fact of nature, and that's that. I think that's perfectly reasonable to take that view. But I think some atheists, new atheists, they're not very sophisticated. They basically redefine what nothingness is, and then argue that they've answered this question. That's philosophically just bankrupt. And you see that many of this new atheist literature is quite unsophisticated and non-serious. And on my view, the strongest reason why I believe in God, I think, is the fear of nihilism, what Nietzsche said, that basically life without God becomes meaningless. And there's a very good video that I would point you to that kind of tells you why I personally, hold on to this belief in God. And the Islamic philosophers, of course, bring strong arguments. They do argue that religion uses the language of metaphors, symbols, and allegories to convey higher truths about how to live the ethical and good life, the meaningful life. The point here is that Islamic rationalists and philosophers of the past did come up with very sophisticated views about religion. And I think we should go back and look at some of them to give us inspiration. A lot of the stuff that you see on YouTube between Muslims, many of them who are quite fundamentalist, and new atheists who are quite bombastic. I think this discourse is very simplistic, unsophisticated, non-serious. All right, so we've talked about reason in Hanbali belief. We've talked about reason in Mu'tazili viewpoints. Let's talk about the Asharis, who are kind of the midway point and do become kind of Islamic orthodoxy. They are semi-rationalists, I would say, because they have this instrumental use of reason. That is, reason is not this independent thing that we use on our own. It's just used in the defense of revelation. So it's quite instrumental. So the Al-Ashari, the founder, was originally a Mu'tazili himself, and he converted to the side of the Hanbalis after having several dreams in the month of Ramadan, during which apparently the Prophet Muhammad appeared to him and urged him to support what was related from himself, that is the hadith. And that's when Imam Ashari promptly abandoned the Mu'tazili camp and joined the Hanbalis. So you see, again, two things. One, ilham is very important, this idea of divine inspiration, and also this idea of hadith. So Islamic orthodoxy was founded on this belief on the primacy of hadith. So initially he abandoned the Mu'tazili camp and joined the Hanbalis, but then he had another updated dream in which the Prophet arrived to him and he was very displeased with him and said to Imam Ashari, "I did not tell you to give up rational arguments, but rather to use it to support the true hadiths." And so that's when he founded the Ashari school of thought. And here's one description of the Ashari school of thought, which is philosophically anti-philosophical, in the same way that Imam Shafi'i's jurisprudence was rationalistically anti-rational. That is just how Imam Shafi'i used human reasoning. Remember, he used qiyas in the defense of kind of textual Sunni uber orthodoxy. In a similar way, Imam Ashari is doing the same thing with Kalam, or theology. All right, so they use reason to defend revelation. Now, the Asharis would say that reason is necessary because it brings you to Islam. So in their view, reason is also prior to revelation. But in their view, once you accept Islam, then reason submits to revelation. That is, you leave reason once you cross that threshold, then you leave reason at the front door. You don't use reason anymore unless you're using it to defend revelation against kind of heretical or non-Muslim groups. Now, that's quite complicated. I think this is where I will now take questions, and we'll carry on from there. So, does anyone have a question? So I'm going to encourage video questions. So let's, Imam Chaplain Muhammad, if you are there, do you mind, instead of taking it as a written question, do you mind asking it as a verbal question?
Sure, no problem. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
So my question was, this came up when you were talking about Ibn Sina, question. It's a general question and specific question about like what your thoughts are about sort of the, I would say, takfir of Ibn Sina by Al-Ghazali, and just in general, the takfir that takes place within these various groups.
Thank you so much for that question. So what I would say is that takfir, and for those of you who don't know what takfir is, it is excommunication. It is declaring someone a non-Muslim, a kafir, an infidel. And it also makes their blood halal, that is licit to shed. So it's not just a statement that I disagree with them. It's actually a belief that they are apostate, they're murtad, and they are kafir, they're infidel, and the state can kill them, and even anyone can go and kill them, and there's really should be no retribution for that. So we're going to talk about takfir in a future lecture, I hope, especially on this topic of Imam Ghazali. What I would say is this. I, of course, disagree with Imam Ghazali's takfir of Ibn Sina. And we're going to talk about the 3 points on which he did do that takfir in either next lecture or the lecture after that. And we'll see that there are quite problematic grounds on which he does this takfir. I would want to believe and hope that the Islamic rationalists and philosophers did not do takfir, but that's not the case. What we see in Islamic history is that all groups were doing takfir of all the other groups. And not only would they do takfir, they would do takfir of anyone who doubts the takfir. So they would say anyone who believes in X is a kafir. Anyone who doubts that that person is a kafir is himself a kafir. And it would be this kind of endless, infinite regress of takfir. I think this is something very harmful in our tradition. The fact that everyone was doing it to everyone else should tell us something. The Islamic uber-orthodoxy, the Hanbalis were doing it to the Islamic orthodoxy. The Islamic orthodoxy was doing it to the Mu'tazilis. What I would also say is that as you move from the right to the left of the spectrum, there's a lot less takfir going on. So the Islamic philosophers are doing a lot less takfir than the Hanbalis. But everyone is doing the takfir, but the more kind of quote unquote uber-orthodox you are or orthodox you are, the more takfir that you are doing. So that's how I would answer that. I will get into the specifics of Imam Ghazali's takfir in a future lecture. All right, and we'll talk about, so I do have a question, what does it mean that a kafir's blood is halal? This is a technical theological question. In Islamic history, it didn't actually mean that they were killed. In fact, that was very rare that that would happen. But we're gonna talk about takfir in a future class in more detail. All right, and let's have Khurram. Khurram, go ahead, please ask your question.
Assalamu alaikum. Very much, I guess, looking for your opinion on this question. And it just left me.
Okay, no worries. We can come back to you if you want. Okay, so now Etisham has a question. Again, going back to my earlier question, which I asked during Sufism lecture, these new traditions or schools of thought popped out due to some sort of vacuum, or did not pop out due to some sort of vacuum. So the question is, why this space existed which let these schools of thought grow and flourish? What I would say is that as Islam expanded into these regions, they encountered non-Muslim groups, and there was an environment that was encouraged. And we're going to see how the Abbasids, they encouraged this environment of discourse and debate. And that's how they felt that wisdom, you reached ultimate truths and wisdom. So it was actually seen as a positive thing. Now, that was to the chagrin of the Hanbalis and the uber-Orthodox, of course, but we're going to see that Islamic rationalism and philosophy is thriving during this period, this early period of Islam, which is called, quote unquote, the golden age of Islam. Let's take one more question by Raza Ali, and then we're going to continue, and I'll try to catch up with questions during the break. Please, Raza, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure if it's entirely a question or maybe a comment. You mentioned that the Hanafis were referred as the Ahlul Rai, but I think that is also a pejorative use of those words, right? That they didn't refer themselves as Ahlul Rai. Others who were more orthodox than them, the Ahlul Hadith, they were calling them Ahlul Rai, as in, well, you use your reason as opposed to we use the tradition.
Thank you. I think that's probably true. That is probably a pejorative term. However, I leave open the possibility, I would have to do research on this, that maybe Rai did not have that negative connotation at this early period, but later did. But I think you're probably right, especially after a few years. Okay, so let's continue, and then we'll come back to questions. So we've talked about the role of reason in the three schools: the Hanbalis school, the Mu'tazili school and finally the Ash'ari school. Now we're going to talk about what's called the Euthyphro Dilemma. I'm sure you've heard of this. Goes back to Plato, who asked this question in one of his plays. He put it in the Socrates basically asks Euthyphro. These are two characters in a play. We're talking about the ancient Greeks here, and they had a lot of wisdom. But basically, this was a philosophical question. The philosophical question was, and this is quite complicated here the way it's worded, but is that which is holy loved by the gods because it is holy, or is it holy because it is loved by the gods? In other words, is something good, halal, because God says it's halal? Or is it halal, does God make it halal because it is good by its very nature? That's the question that they're debating. What comes first? Is God the one who, because of his decree, something becomes good or bad? Or does God make things good or bad because they are good or bad? This is a philosophical question that has been asked since the time of the ancient Greeks, and now the Muslims will have to deal with this question as well. Now, this is called the Euthyphro Dilemma, and there's two horns that you could take to answer this dilemma. Horn one is that good means whatever God commands. This is called divine command ethics. That is, things are halal and haram because God decrees that, and that's the only reason why. Horn two is that good exists independently of God, and God commands these things because he knows that they are good or bad, or he forbids them because they are bad. Now, both of these horns, and this diagram I took from, I think it's probably someone who has kind of an anti-religious viewpoint, but we see that both of these horns have potential problems to them. In horn number one, morality becomes kind of arbitrary. Good as God could make murder good, and then that's would become good. But then horn two makes God seem kind of impotent or unimportant, right? Because he's simply redundant. He's just making whatever is already good as good. So what's the use of God and what's the use of revelation? You could just use your human reason to figure out what's good and what's bad. So you see that these are the two horns of the Euthyphro Dilemma. The Ash'aris, which is Islamic orthodoxy, and the Hanbalis, by the way, they will take the first horn. They will take what's called divine command ethics. Things are good simply because God commands them to be good. You can't use your human reason to arrive at what's good and bad. The Mu'tazilis, which are the Islamic rationalists, they will take the second horn, and they will say that makes morality too subjective and arbitrary, and that good exists independently, and God commands things because they are good in and of themselves, and he forbids things because they are bad in and of themselves. Now, I will point out that, and I apologize for the kind of blasphemous kind of pictures here, but I had to borrow this image. I would point out that there is now what's called the modified divine command theory. And this is the view that I take. So it's actually a third horn. And the third horn, I think, solves both problems. This is just an aside, but that's myself who's taking this third horn. But basically, this argues that God, by his very essence, by his very nature, is good. And so he commands based on his own moral nature. That is, this goodness kind of flows out from him. He created the world, so he is good. He is not anything that is bad, and this kind of outflows from God. So yes, it is the natural outgrowth of God's will and commands, but it's not completely arbitrary either. So this kind of, you can basically have your cake and eat it too if you take the modified divine command theory, at least in my viewpoint. This allows me, for example, to take the Mu'tazili meta-ethical viewpoint without having the problems that the Ash'aris would point out to. So this is kind of my view, but just as an aside. So let's again talk about those two horns. The first horn, this is divine command theory. This is called by academics the ethical subjectivism. Why is it subjectivism? Because God just arbitrarily commands what is good and just. And basically they would take a view like this verse, verily God is never unjust in the least degree. They would say, well, the Ash'aris would say, this verse is true because God is definitionally definitionally just. That is, whatever God does is just. If he killed babies and commanded that, that would be just, because God cannot be unjust. If God commanded you to wage war and slaughter civilians, men, women, and children, to bash baby heads into rocks, this is just an extreme example to illustrate this point, then that would be right and correct. That is because injustice cannot be attributed to the ultimate creator. Injustice is to infringe on the right of another, but nobody has a right before God. So for example, if I steal your laptop and kill you, that's an injustice upon you, because I took your right, which is your right of your property, your laptop, and your right to your life. And so that's an injustice, and I could be considered unjust. But God owns you, he owns me, he owns the laptop, so God cannot infringe upon anyone, so therefore God cannot be unjust at all. So this is the Ash'ari viewpoint. Now, having said that, Ash'aris and later Ash'aris especially would point out, even so, God's habit, his general habit, is that he does line up his command with our own human utility. So they would not say that God commands any of these horrible things, and that's because it's just generally God's habit to align his command with human utility. So that kind of removes a little bit of the arbitrariness and brings the Ash'ari view closer to a Mu'tazili viewpoint somewhat. Now, Mu'tazilis take the second horn. In their view, the Ash'ari view renders that Quranic verse and similar verses into meaningless tautologies. That is, the Quran is saying that God will never commit injustice, and then basically the Ash'aris are saying anything God does is just. So in the Ash'ari viewpoint, this is kind of rendering it meaningless, and it's infringing, it's demeaning God to take this viewpoint. In their view, beauty and ugliness, good and bad, are qualities belonging intrinsically to whatever is beautiful and ugly, whatever is good and bad. And God specifically pre-programs us with human reason so that we know right from wrong. Now, whichever view you take will have a profound effect on your ethical or your meta-ethical viewpoint, your framework. The Mu'tazilis argue that it is through human reason, in concert with revelation, that we know good from evil. In their viewpoint, the Quran commands al-ma'ruf, that is the good, which actually technically means the known or the well-known amongst humans. That is, it is known to human beings as such, and it's simply affirmed in scripture. So the Quran says it enjoins the good and forbids the evil. Both of these are known to human beings, and the Quran doesn't go into all of the specifics. These are just known to all humans that are reasonable people. On their viewpoint, on the Mu'tazili viewpoint, human beings could theoretically use their reason to ascertain the good and evil by themselves, if they had all the necessary information available to them with no defects in their knowledge, outside motivations, etc. Since this kind of perfect state of being is unlikely, God sends prophets and imparts revelation to human beings as a grace from him. This is, again, the same word that we saw in the Shi'i viewpoint of lutf, that God is sending prophets and messengers as a grace, as a kindness to humankind. Now, I did a fellowship in medical ethics, and I focused on Islamic bioethics. What I quickly realized is, whichever meta-ethical viewpoint you took, it would have profound effects on how you engage in ethical dialogue. I realized that if I took the orthodox viewpoint, this Ash'ari meta-ethical viewpoint, I really could not engage in meaningful dialogue with secular bioethicists. Because for Ash'aris, for Islamic orthodoxy, it's just a matter of finding the right text, a hadith, and applying it. This is seen in their viewpoint as a quote-unquote neutral process. You just take these data points, these hadiths, or sometimes rarely Quranic verses, and you insert them, you input them into this kind of fatwa machine, and then you pull the crank and out comes a fatwa. That's kind of the Ash'ari viewpoint. If that's your viewpoint, it's very hard for me as a bioethicist to engage in bioethical discourse with non-Muslim or secular academics, because they don't agree with these data points, these revelation, this Quran and Hadith. But if you take a Mu'tazili meta-ethical viewpoint, you can use human reason to discourse and dialogue with non-Muslims and use human reason to locate shared grounds of truth. You could still use revelation as a guidepost, as an anchoring point, but you do have a way to discourse in a neutral space with outsiders. So you will see that these two views will persist in Islamic discourse. The Ash'ari meta-ethical viewpoint will dominate in Sunni thoughts. The Mu'tazili meta-ethical viewpoint will actually be taken up by Shias and also by Sunni modernists in the modern era. So you'll see these two views will battle each other throughout Islamic history. Now, again, to be fair, the Ash'ari view does allow for the fact that usually God's habit is to legislate based on human utility. So this does open up an avenue for Ash'aris to engage in this kind of discourse. So I don't want to be unfair to that viewpoint. Now, let's look at what this does for moral responsibility in Ash'arism, which is Islamic orthodoxy. The position of the Ash'aris is that the mind is unable to know the rule of God and about the acts of those morally responsible, that is the mukallafun, except by means of his messengers and inspired book. What this means, and this is a quote taken from a very famous Sunni manual of fiqh, The Reliance of the Traveler. If you go to the very beginning of this book, it basically says that if you theoretically lived on a remote island in complete isolation, and you never heard about the prophet or the message, then you would not be morally responsible before God for anything. You would be completely innocent of anything you do. And I think this poses problems. So basically, would such a person then be allowed to murder and kill randomly and mutilate people and kill babies, etc.? And then as soon as they convert to Islam, they're saved? This is kind of the orthodox viewpoint. I think that that's kind of morally problematic. It also creates issues, and we see this when I talk about Islamic bioethics. For example, the issue of female circumcision or female genital mutilation. If you just take the viewpoint that this is what the text says, this is what I'm going to implement, it does create a problem. And it also creates certain double standards. So you can't use human reason to say, for example, that, okay, if you're saying that it's mandatory that Islam has to be preached in all religion, in all countries. And in fact, if a country bans the preaching of Islam, that jihad is mandated against such a country, if that's your viewpoint, which some people take, unfortunately, then couldn't you also say, then how come you ban the preaching of Islam in Saudi Arabia? The preaching of non-Muslim traditions like Judaism, Christianity, etc. in Saudi Arabia? Isn't that a double standard? Well, if you take this kind of meta-ethical viewpoint, you say that's fine. It doesn't have to match up with human reason. We just follow the quote unquote text. So I do think that this creates certain problems. Now, Mu'tazilis, on the other hand, will argue for moral universalism, that even people living in far-off lands know that you must, for example, thank your benefactor, right? If someone gives something to you, you have to thank them for it. If they give you a gift, you have to thank them. And that's actually what the basis of religion is in the Mu'tazili viewpoint. Everyone, everywhere, knows that you should not murder someone. There's no real place where that is considered completely okay. Now, there might be exceptions, but basically, the Mu'tazilis are arguing, look, we can agree on some basics. So they will argue for moral universalism or moral objectivism, which they ground in natural law theory, which we're not able to get into detail, by the way. Now, Imam Ghazali, who was an Ash'ari, argues against this moral universalism and in favor of moral relativism. And to be honest, many of his arguments will now find a lot of support in the Western Academy. Moral universalism and objectivism is no longer considered fashionable in the Western Academy. I myself hold on to it, but I must say that I'm in the minority. Moral subjectivism or relativism is really the dominant trend. And Ghazali comes up with many very strong arguments in favor of this moral relativism. He basically gives countless examples of other civilizations where you have certain beliefs that totally are in discord with our own beliefs. And he says, how can you say that we all have shared moral framework? he discounts this completely. Now, so Mu'tazilis hold the view that God can indeed punish an actor for committing actions known to be detestable by the intellect before having received a messenger. So they would say that, look, everyone knows that killing a baby is something bad and that they would be held accountable to God. Ghazali would say, hey, wait a second, didn't they kill female babies in the pre-Islamic period? And they thought that that was considered okay. So this is the kind of debate that these two sides are having. Now, I do think that the Mu'tazilis have to argue that you can and you must use your human reason to arrive at the belief in God. The question is, if human beings can and must reach the sacred law's precepts by themselves, even if they don't have access to revelation, then what is the purpose of revelation? Is this not redundant? That is the view of the Asharis. The Mu'tazilis, of course, would say that it's God's grace that we get revelation, because reaching these truths by ourselves is very difficult to do, and so God graces us with prophets and messengers to help us along the path. But this is the debate. Now, hadiths. We talked about the importance of hadiths, and I think we're going to go to break very shortly. I know this is a lot of information, but hadith is very important to the battle between traditionalism and rationalism. Why? Why is it important? It's important because if you take the Ash'ari or Hanbali viewpoints, the Islamic orthodoxy viewpoint, you cannot use your human reason to arrive at, it's something that you want to minimize as much as possible. So you need revelation to guide you on every minor aspect of life. If you can't find a text for it, the minimum or the maximum that you want to do is use an analogical reasoning to minimally use human reason to arrive at a new ruling. But you really need a lot of hadiths in order to arrive at what's good and what's bad. Meanwhile, if you're a Mu'tazili, if you're an Islamic rationalist, you can use your human reason. And so the Quran can use kind of general and even vague statements like do good, don't do bad. And for a Mu'tazili, that makes a lot of sense. But a Ash'ari or a Hanbali would want more specifics. What is good and what is bad? So the hadiths are very key. So in the Hanbali view, hadiths are super important. And we see even Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal favored a weak hadith even over someone's opinion. The Ash'aris similarly said that we cannot use reason to judge the content of hadiths, right? The most that they could do is view the chains of narration. Now, of course, Jonathan Brown does say that they did view the content of the hadith, but then criticize the chain if they didn't like it, but this is a longer story. At least on paper, both Hanbalis and Ash'aris are opposed to human reason in the face of revelation. They really want to minimize reason as much as possible. Meanwhile, the Mu'tazilis favor human reason, and conversely, they show a very cautious or even skeptical attitude towards hadiths. Some, a minority, even rejected hadiths entirely. So that sometimes people think that this is just a modern idea kind of brought on by the West. That's not true. We have this in early Islam, that there was a group that completely rejected hadiths. But for the most part, most of these Mu'tazilis wanted to minimize hadith. On their viewpoint, and this is how they would word it, how could you base your religion on so-and-so said to so-and-so? And this is kind of the idea of the Chinese whisper, that if you do whisper something, you probably did this in your classrooms, you whisper one thing and then you pass it along the students. And then by the end, it's completely something different. So this is what the Mu'tazilis are arguing, that we can't base the foundations of our religion based on such a shaky foundation. They did use, generally, they did still use hadiths, but they argue that hadiths, when they are used, have to correspond to 1, the Quran, and 2, to human reason. Otherwise, they are to be rejected. And we see this kind of idea brought back in the modern period. Again, it has its precedent. The Mu'tazilis are arguing this all the way back then. So what Hanbalis and Ash'aris would do, and kind of the famous example is the stoning. Stoning of adulterers is not found in the Quran. It's actually a different punishment. It's either house arrest or flogging. The Hanbalis and the Ash'aris will say, this is in the hadith. The hadith are reliable, so we need to take it. And the hadith can actually rule over or modulate the Quran. And so that's what they would accept stoning. And that's why it's part of Islamic orthodoxy to have that viewpoint. But the Mu'tazilis could say, no, it's not part of the Quran, and therefore we reject it because it contradicts the Quran. Here is a book by Professor Jonathan Brown, who's actually one of the defenders of, he's a Muslim academic. He's quite knowledgeable. I respect him deeply. He is one of the defenders of hadith in the modern day. And I just refer you to his book. I had the question that somebody was quite surprised to hear that in this class, somebody sent me this question or feedback. They were quite surprised that there was a group in Islam that would favor hadith over the Quran. I would say, yes, that is something surprising, but more so, it's not just a small group here and there who had this view. Rather, this became the dominant view in Sunni orthodoxy to favor the hadith, the sunnah, as understood in the hadith, over the Quran. So you see here, Jonathan Brown in his book on hadith says, I'm reading the highlighted part, quote, although no Muslim would claim that the word of Muhammad is ontologically equal or superior to the word of God, that is, formally we do recognize that the Quran is superior, practically speaking, early Sunnis came to the view that, quote, the sunnah, that is, as contained in the hadith, came to rule over the Quran. It is not the Quran that rules over the sunnah. And as another quote there, you see, as many early Muslims noted, the quote, the Quran needs the sunnah more than the sunnah needs the Quran, unquote. And this is because in their view, the hadiths have all the details and the Quran just speaks in generality. And again, if you look at a book of fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence, it's full of hadiths. The Quranic verses that are scattered here and there are really just window dressing. If you eliminated them from the text, you wouldn't really alter that text at all. Whereas if you took out the hadith, that would be the whole basis of the book of fiqh and it would fall down. And so Jonathan Brown says, and that's the last highlighted part, all of these groups have historically recognized that whichever way one phrases it, the Prophet's legacy, that is, as contained in the hadith, has profoundly informed and altered the way the Quran's altered the way the Quran's legal message has been understood. And he goes on. He admits, as I said in lecture 2, that the word sunnah, of course, was not fully synonymous with hadith in early Islamic history. But then look at the end of the paragraph. By the time of Malik's student Ash-Shafi'i, however, among the Ahl al-Hadith, a concerted study of hadiths had become the essential route for learning and implementing the sunnah of the Prophet. In fact, it becomes really the only route of knowing the sunnah. And then it is worth noting that accepting the sunnah and hadith as an essential source. Okay, now he's talking about how this was not an uncontested idea in early Islam. And so this is kind of the page number of his book, 152, that I refer you to, where he talks about the people of Kalam who pushed back against Imam Shafi'i and were skeptical or even rejected hadith entirely and were skeptical of it. And then the Mu'tazilis are of this viewpoint as well. So, let's talk about Qadi Abdul Jabbar. He's writing in the 11th century. He's kind of known as the great systemizer, and he's kind of the culmination of Mu'tazili viewpoints. And he basically said that we cannot use solitary or ahad hadiths when it comes to matters of beliefs. We can only use mutawatir hadiths. And if we do use solitary hadiths in fiqh or Islamic jurisprudence, we can only use it if it's a reliable chain, but also number 2, that it doesn't contradict what's in the Quran. And finally, it must correspond to reason as well. And if it does not, then we have to interpret it metaphorically. We'll see how this idea will manifest itself, as well as the Islamic philosophers will take this viewpoint to its kind of zenith, you can say. And so just a couple more slides and then we're going to go for a break. I know it's gone quite late and it's a lot of information. So because of this, Mu'tazilis will reject a lot of beliefs of that Islamic orthodoxy will accept. For example, intercession. They rejected intercession of imams and saints, living or dead. They minimized or even rejected intercession of the Prophet Muhammad. And for example, you see he was asked about this hadith about the Prophet's intercession, and he just rejects it. And he says, it is not permissible to substitute for what is clear in the Quran with a hadith that is just not clearly reliable. So, and the Mu'tazilis would argue that it goes against the Quran and God's justice to accept intercession. Every human being must stand before God on his or her own merits. And this is why they're called the divine people of, the people of divine unity and justice. Unity because they think intercession interferes with God's unity, tawheed. It's shirk in their viewpoint. And number two, it clashes with God's justice because to take someone out of hellfire just based because so-and-so said so, in their viewpoint, would go against the egalitarian nature of Islam. Again, on their viewpoint. You can disagree. I'm just trying to share their viewpoint. They rejected miracles. So we saw in previous lectures how the Hanbalis, Ash'aris, and miracles and Sufis accepted miracles of the prophets and saints, and the Shias accepted these for their imams. The Mu'tazilis, on the other hand, denied the miracles of the saints and imams, and they rejected all but the evidentiary miracles of the prophets. That is, they said the entire logic of miracles is to give proof for the prophecy of a prophet. And if you accept these kind of saintly miracles, then those are confusing people with the miracles of the prophets. And if you believe in miracles done by non-saints and miracles done by evil people, then that's even more confusing. So that's what the Mu'tazilis would argue. It's also important to keep in mind that the Islamic philosophers did believe, and we're going to talk about them in the next class, they did believe in miracles, but they naturalized them, as Avicenna did, or else some of them, like Ibn Rushd, Averroes, as we will see, he may not have believed in miracles literally and instead of taken them as allegories. And we'll talk about this maybe in the next class or the one after that. Now, the Mu'tazilis are also going to disagree with ilham after the Prophet or divine inspiration. We saw how the Hanbalis, Ash'aris, Sufis, and Shias, they all affirm ilham after the prophets. The Mu'tazilis deny or at least minimize ilham after the prophets. They do not think it is a valid source of knowledge. They think that that challenges the authority of revelation. They think it challenges the authority of the Quran. We'll see how the Islamic philosophers did believe in ilham, but they naturalized it. We'll talk about that in the next class. The Mu'tazilis, based on the fact that the punishments of the graves are only narrated in ahad sources, the solitary hadiths, they reject the punishments or the rewards in the graves. And we see how here a Hanbali scholar is pushing back and saying, look, if you reject the punishment of the grave, the entire foundation of Sunni Islam will fall apart because you're questioning the reports of our prophets upon which Sunni Islam is based. Similarly, the Mu'tazilis many of them would deny the arrival of Dajjal or the Antichrist, who already did arrive, of course, with Donald Trump. Some of them did deny the the arrival of Imam Mahdi. Some of them, it seems, may have affirmed Christ's crucifixion. They took a more apparent reading of the Quranic verses 355 and 5117. And they might even have denied the second coming of Christ. I have to look into this a little bit further because Harvard's libraries are closed right now. I was limited in my sources, but Todd Lawson did write a book on this topic. And it does seem that Zaydis, many of them did affirm Christ's crucifixion and deny the second coming of Christ. And the Zaydis would take on Mu'tazili viewpoints. So that's something quite interesting. All right, so I think this is where we will take a break. So I wanted to get through some more stuff, but let's take a short 7-minute break and we will come back. Thank you so much. All right, we're not quite back yet, but because we have a lot of information today, I want to see if in the break anybody wants to ask a question. I can start with, great, excellent, Khurram, shoot.
Assalamu alaikum. So my question was the one from earlier, was that, historically we've been seeing the same sort of threads, sort of sustain, take on different names. But the fact that they've sustained, I've heard the argument made that they kind of need each other. That for Islam to kind of stay what it is, you need one group that's sort of on one side pulling and tugging, as hard as it can. You need one group on the other side to pull and tug as hard as it can for the middle to kind of stay where it does. Does that seem appealing to you?
I think that's very appealing to me. What I would say is that, yes, we need diversity of viewpoint. The problem, I think, arises with the issue of takfir and persecution. And this has happened on both sides. Historically, it's more on one side than the other. But that's the problem when you silence the other group. And I think that silencing continues to this day. So you have a suppression of the diversity of thought. So I agree with you. I think we need all of these different sides to just dialogue and discourse with each other. And you see this like in other faith traditions where they have, groups on all sides, liberal, conservative, and they coexist with each other. But in our case, really, these thoughts can get you killed. And that's why I put a haram rating on here. All right, let's take one more question. Reza, go ahead.
It may be two questions, I don't know, but I'll ask them. You mentioned that Mu'tazili thought was to some degree preserved in the Shi'i thought. So number one, did the idea of adala or justice come from Mu'tazili thought in the Shi'i thought? And second, how would the Mu'tazili explain Khizr killing the boy in the story of Moses?
Okay, great two questions. So as far as the first question you asked, so some of Mu'tazilism was absorbed by Shi'ism. Is that where they got their idea of adala or justice? I would say, again, as an intellectual historian, it's hard for me to say where something comes from. It could just be that Shi'ism already had this kind of idea, so it gelled well with the Mu'tazili viewpoint. So I don't like to, it's very hard to answer a question about origins. So I'm gonna have to cop out on that answer, I apologize. I'll have to also cop out on the second answer, the second question about Khidr. So that's about esoteric knowledge. I actually don't know how the Mu'tazilis would respond to, I mean, I have certain ideas how they could respond to it, but I don't have an answer as far as how they would. And that's about a story in the Quran. For those of you who don't know, it's about a story in the Quran about where Khizr does certain things that from a rational sense don't seem to make sense, but in the end they do make sense. And I think that's where the Mu'tazilis would focus, that in the end they did have reasons for them. We may not know what those reasons are, and that's why revelation is important, because we don't have all the facts. So I guess that's how a Mu'tazili would answer that. But what the Mu'tazili would say is, look, in the end they did have reasons. We may not have known them, but to say that it's just kind of God commands whatever, that they would disagree with. All right, so let's get started. I do see Reshma's question. I'll try to circle back to that question. I think it's going to be a hard one to answer, though. All right, so let's go to, just give me a second while I find my slide. Okay. So Mu'tazilis had two basic principles. They're in their name: divine unity and divine justice. These are the two principles of Mu'tazilism, and it kind of encompasses most of their key kind of doctrinal views. But I lied. There are actually 5 principles of Mu'tazilism. Why? Because the second one, divine justice, has kind of 3 more sub-points to it. One is the promise and the threat. Then there's the intermediate position, and there's enjoining the good and forbidding the evil. I'm not going to be able to go into all of these 5 points, but I would say, so I'll just quickly talk about 3 and 5. 3 is basically that the Quran promises paradise for those who do good and threatens those who do evil. And that's why number 5 is important, which is you need to enjoin the good and eschew or forbid the evil, stay away from evil. That has to do with their emphasis on divine justice, because God must recompense people for their good deeds. So the Mu'tazilis have a very strong viewpoint here. They say that God, by his nature, must reward the good when you do good. Whereas Hanbalis and Asharis would say, no, God is not obligated to do anything. And so the Mu'tazili are taking a much stricter view on this. That's those two viewpoints. I bolded the fourth one, the intermediate position, because this is actually the story that this is related to the religious issue, the controversy in which Mu'tazilism supposedly formed, in which their founder seceded from their study circle. So what is the intermediate position? Well, it's intermediate between what the Mu'tazilis see as two extreme views. The first is the view of the Kharijites, the Khawarij. I'm sure you've heard of this group. They were an early group who argued that major sins cause Muslims to become kafirs, who should then be fought and killed. What's interesting is their slogan, no rule but that of God, is actually a slogan used by modern day Islamists. It's the exact same slogan or very similar. That is why many of the terrorists today, the terrorist groups, are called modern day Khawarij, or some people believe that they are the literal Kharijites. But that's quite interesting. And so this group of Kharijites, they arrive, they actually, this is due to the events. And again, this is not a course on Islamic history, so I'm kind of skipping over some of the Islamic history. But this was in the dispute between Ali and Muawiyah. Basically, Ali, the fourth caliph, agreed to arbitration with his opponent Muawiyah to stop bloodshed. Because he agreed to do this, some within his own party broke off and said that arbitration is not acceptable when it comes to matters of God. And so you see this kind of extremist element even back then. To counter this Kharijite viewpoint, this idea of irja came, which is the group of the Murjiites came. Their view, they come from the word irja, which means to postpone. So they said that judgment should be postponed to God on the hereafter, and that whoever professes Islam should be considered a Muslim, and judgment postponed to God. Belief is what matters. And they would also say that every Muslim is saved. Now, Mustafa Akyol, who I'm a big fan of, he's an Islamic thinker from Turkey. He's a big fan of the Murji'a, and I can see why. However, I would point out that it's not, all rosy, this idea. It is from this idea, after all, that the belief comes that some in the orthodoxy or ultra-orthodoxy will believe that the most sinful Muslim is better than the best non-Muslim. So I remember being in a debate once where they were literally arguing that Osama bin Laden, they weren't supporters of Osama bin Laden, but they said that Osama bin Laden at the end of the day will go to heaven, and Mother Teresa, which whether you like her or not, but I mean, she's kind of this prototypical good non-Muslim, Mother Teresa will go to hellfire. So it's kind of this idea that the Murji'a are arguing for. The Mu'tazilis will take the middle position. This is what they call al-manzila bain al-manzilatayn. That major sins actually cause Muslims to become fasiqun. That is, there is this third, it's not just Muslim, non-Muslim, but kafir. Between mu'min and kafir, there's a middle position, which is called fasiqun, or the fasiqs, and they are sinful, and God will judge them according to their deeds, and they can go to hellfire, and they can even go to eternal hellfire. Okay. Again, back to the same slide, because I know this is extremely confusing, but trust me, this is important, okay? These debates are very relevant to understand current debates. And if you don't understand it, you're gonna be hampered in the way you do dialogue. So again, remember, the Hanbalis, they are kind of the uber traditionalists. They're not really a Kalam school, they oppose Kalam or theology. The Hanbalis today, what are they? They are reincarnated, you can say, in the Wahhabis or the Salafis of Saudi Arabia. The Mu'tazilis are the Islamic rationalists. At that time, there were Hanafis, and they were condemned as the Qadirites. We'll talk about what that pejorative term means. Nowadays, Hanafis are not Mu'tazilis. So the Hanafi school later gravitated towards the other schools, towards traditionalism. But the Mu'tazilis today, they're reincarnated in spirit, at least, in the Islamic modernists. Basically, all Islamic reformists, I mean, they're pulling in a lot of these same ideas of the Mu'tazilis, whether they say it or not, by the way. And then finally, you have the Asharis, which are now pretty similar to the Maturidis, so I just consider them the Asharis. They are the semi-rationalists. They're trying to do that middle ground, and they are what becomes known as Islamic orthodoxy. And that's what's taught again at Al-Azhar University. Now, so those are those three groups again. They're going to debate on another issue, which is super important to understand, which is free will and predestination. That's where that pejorative term Qadarites comes from, or Qadariya, from the word Qadar, which is confusing. It comes from the word Qudra, which means capability and power. Basically, the Mu'tazilis believe that human beings have free will and the power to act on that will. And because of that, they were labeled the Qadariya. Whether there was another group before the Mu'tazilis called the Qadariya, it's hard to say. On the flip side was a group called the Mujbirites, or the Jabariya, depending on how you would say it. That comes from the word Jabr, or coercion, also can mean destiny. That is, human beings are compelled to act by God based on divine predestination. So we see in early Islam, the issue about free will versus predestination, which is a problem in all faith traditions, comes up. Now, whether or not this group of Jabariya existed, Professor Khalid al-Ruwayhib says they actually did not exist, and that this was just a group that the Islamic Orthodoxy accepted that it existed so that they could claim the vaunted middle ground themselves. And it really was just a pejorative term that the Mu'tazilis used for the Islamic Orthodoxy or the Ash'aris. We're going to talk about this a little bit further. But it gets even more confusing because Qadar can also eventually came to mean predestination, fate, and divine foreordainment. And it in fact became a central aspect of Sunni traditionalism or orthodoxy. That is, the word Qadar eventually came to mean its exact opposite. Why? The reason is that the Mu'tazilis, they basically said, I'm rubber and you're glue. Whatever you say bounces off me and goes on to you. That is, we're not the Qadarites, you guys are the Qadarites, all right? And the reason, by the way, for that is, actually, let me show you that, why that is. No, I'll show that later. But basically, it's because there are hadiths that actually condemn the Qadarites, which, I mean, from a historical critical perspective, come on, that's very problematic. But because of that, nobody wants to be called the Qadarites. And so the Mu'tazilis will sling that back on to the Islamic Orthodoxy. All right, so let's keep going. Sorry, I had to. So let's talk, why is there this debate about free will and predestination? Well, the reason is that in the Quran, it's not very clear. There are certain verses that seem to point in the direction of predeterminism. That is, God determines everything in the world. What you do, what you eat, what you choose to watch on TV, everything. Well, there's verses in the Quran like this, that everything is preserved in a book or the preserved tablet. That God is the creator of all things, even your human actions. God created you and that which you make, that is your actions. There's even a verse that says, if good befalls them, they say this is from God, but if evil befalls them, they say this is from you, that is the prophets. But say to them, all is from God, good and bad. On the other hand, the very next verse says, whatever good befalls you, it is from God, and whatever evil befalls you, it is from yourself. How do we reconcile these different verses? So the Quran is not very clear about this free will versus predestination. Again, the Quran is not a book of theology. It is left up to theologians to debate this issue and fight amongst one another. So the Mu'tazilis will affirm free will. They argue, again, it would violate divine justice, which is in their name, if God compelled someone to do evil and then punish them for it. Therefore, human beings must possess free will. Otherwise, how can they be held to account for what they do, good or bad? It is also, in their view, unacceptable to attribute evil to God, the commanding of killing and eating babies. It would be absurd on their view to say that God commands what he forbids. That is, it's logically absurd to say that on the one hand, God commands you not to kill, and then on the other hand, he commands by his will that you do kill. So that's a logical conundrum on their view. The Mu'tazilis did say that God is the one who gives us the capability, the qudra, to act, but they argue that the action is of our own free will. That is, God designates us the capability, he gives us the capability, and he gives us the capacity to make our own decision. That is, we have our own will and we have our own action to act upon that will. Now, the Mu'tazilis still wanted to observe God's omnipotence, so they said that all power does come from God, who merely designates this ability to human beings. Now, they did have to deal with certain philosophical issues, and Peter Adamson brings up this point. For example, let's say I wanted to eat a pastry. Let's make it a more Muslim-y example. Let's say I want to eat samosas. My wife is making samosas right now. Sorry to be sexist, but literally that's what she's doing right now. And I'm smelling the samosas, okay? And I have this desire to eat the samosa. And if I eat it, it was because of my desire. I didn't have control over my desire. So this actually goes against the idea of free will. And we'll see that even some neuroscientists today, like Sam Harris, who's a new atheist, he does have this deterministic view of the world. But the Mu'tazilis would argue back, yes, that is a problem on our view, but you have the choice of whether you act on that desire or you don't. And you do see that sometimes people do go against their desires. Now, this is a complex philosophical question that doesn't end that debate, but that's just kind of signaling to what their response would be. Now, as far as the Islamic orthodoxy, that is those two groups, Hanbalis and Ash'aris, they would go towards that deterministic view in order to preserve God's untrammeled omnipotence. And we saw how the Sufis themselves had this view. Again, Sufis are part of the Sunni tradition, at least historically speaking. Now, we saw how they said that only God can bring people into the light, and only God is the one who misleads people. Interestingly, even the Islamic philosophers seem to accept a deterministic view of the world. They do so for different reasons. They take a very scientific and causal worldview. This is kind of the reason why Sam Harris takes his deterministic view. So we see the Islamic philosophers also taking this kind of deterministic view of the world. That is, all of your actions are controlled by God. The only holdouts will be the Shias, who accept the Mu'tazili view, and they embrace free will. And of course, the Mu'tazilis. So the Ash'aris, what did they say? They come up, again, the Hanbalis kind of just deny this issue of free will. The Hanbalis are not very consistent because, again, they don't want to engage in Kalam. So they want to affirm free will and determinism at the same time and say, don't debate this issue. It's too complicated. It doesn't make any sense. It's a mystery of God. That's what many of the early Hanbalis will say. For the Ash'aris, that won't be satisfactory because, again, they are Kalam scholars themselves. The Ash'aris will claim to be compatibilist. That is, they reconcile free will with determinism. So they come up with this doctrine of acquisition or qasb, which is God creates the action, but human beings acquire it through their will. God creates, okay, so that's the confusion. So they basically say that you don't actually have the power to do your action. You just intend to do that action, and then you acquire the action from God, God is the one who actually does that action. If you're super confused, you're not the only one. Their opponents would accuse them of sophistry, that this is just wordplay and nonsensical. But they would back this up. And actually, this is consistent with occasionalism, which remind me to talk about later. So God, now here is where I think the rub is. Even though they want to say that there is free will, the problem is that the Ash'aris affirm that God actually is the one who creates the will in the first place. So I think that removes any elements of real free will. And the difference between them and the Mujbarites seems to me to be very minimal. And the Ash'ari viewpoint seems to be very deterministic to me. If you want to see what I mean, look at the Sanusi Creed, which is by a modern scholar who actually was writing a creed. It's an Ash'ari creed, where he argues that he basically says, quote, "We do not agree with the statement that the servant is compelled inwardly, because being compelled is when an action occurs against one's will." This is a little bit of wordplay. They're kind of distancing themselves from the Mujbarites by saying that it's not really being compelled to act, because it only means to be compelled if you're going against your will. But the problem is, at the same time, the same scholar is saying that God is the one who creates the servant's will, action, and power. So where is the room for free will? So what he argues is that it is publicly prohibited to ascribe evil to God, whereas such may be affirmed in a classroom setting. That is, if somebody went out and did fornication, we couldn't say that God is the one who caused them to fornicate, because that would be kind of disrespectful to God. You don't want to say that publicly. The average person would be led astray by that, but that's okay between saying that between you and me in a classroom setting. So you'll see that they have this kind of public view and this private view as well. And here in a footnote, they kind of really, I think this is the bottom line. They write, quote, "The servant is compelled in the image of one with free choice. In reality, however, he has no action, for all actions belong to Allah." So I do think that it is a very deterministic worldview, which leaves very little room for free will. Now, there was this debate about verses in the Quran. Does God mislead the disbeliever? You see this one scholar in the 10th century, and he's more along the Hanbali lines, but it's shared by the Ash'aris, that God does lead astray whom he wills. And we can't say that that's God being unjust, because whatever God does is by definition just. He is too sublime for there to be in his realm what he does not will. So you couldn't, the Mu'tazilis would say, God does not will you to fornicate, because that's against God's will. Although God gives you the power to go against his will and his desire, the Hanbalis and the Ash'aris are saying, no, God is too powerful for there to be anything in his realm that he does not will by himself. He's the Lord of all human beings, the Lord of even their works. Now, as far as Ash'aris, they would also take a viewpoint that is very close to the Murji'ah, as far as whoever professes Islam should be considered a Muslim and any judgment postponed to God. Belief is what matters. And it was a widespread view, not held by everyone, but however, it was a widespread view that every Muslim, even a sinner, will ultimately be saved. They might go to the hellfire for a short time to be purified, but eventually they would come to paradise. Now, this is the slide I wanted to show you earlier about why nobody wants to be called the Qadariyah or the Murji'ah. That's because they have hadiths like this. Two groups of my community have nothing to do with Islam, the Murji'ah and the Qadariyah. Now, do we really take this seriously from an academic historical sense? I guess you could say the Prophet is a prophet and he can foresee these groups, but really this is kind of stretching believability, I think. You have a hadith here that's graded as Sahih, by the way, or Hasan. The Qadaris are the Magians, the fire worshippers of this ummah. If they get sick, do not visit them, and if they die, do not attend their funerals. So it's quite interesting that even based on such kind of historically problematic reports, that people are willing to not go to people's funerals and distance themselves from them. You have hadiths that kind of go along the lines of predestination. And you even have hadiths like these. I'm sure you've seen these being quoted. The Kharijites are the dogs of hellfire, which again was usually viewed as Sahih or Hasan. And then even you have this in Sahih Muslim, that there would arise at the end of the age of a people, that is the Kharijites. So when you meet them, kill them, for you will be rewarded for killing them. So on such historically problematic reports, you even have commands about killing such people. I think this is something that we should think about. And you even have hadith reports predicting what I just said. Soon there will come a time that a man will be reconciling on his pillow, and one of my hadith is narrated to him. He will say, the book of Allah is sufficient for us. Now, this is used as a proof against the people who supposedly reject hadith. But this hadith is itself proof that groups existed in the past who were hesitant about hadith. So I think this is really a problematic way of thinking. But again, I'm taking a historical critical perspective here. That's when I wanted to take the break, by the way. So let's move on. So let's talk about this word. I think I spelled it wrong. No, anthropomorphism. Basically, this is a big word that means talking about something like it's a human. So if you talked about your dog and you said you talked about your dog that it's got human feelings and emotions, which it does have, but if you kind of talk about it like it's a human, that's anthropomorphism. But you can also do that to God. And so this is what a debate will come in early Islam about. On the one hand, the Quran affirms that God is one and that there is nothing like unto him. On the other hand, the Quran uses apparently anthropomorphic language to describe God. For example, the Quran speaks of God's face, eyes, and hands. It also speaks of him sitting on a throne. The Hadiths use even more such language and say, for example, that God descends to the lowest heaven every night to listen to supplicants, and that God has a spatial location, that is, he is located up. Also, the Hadiths speak of God's fingers, feet, etc. So how do we reconcile the first part, that God is one and there's nothing like him, nothing resembles him, with all of these kind of anthropomorphic reports, some in the Quran and others in the Hadith? So here's from the Quran: everything will perish save his face. Then it talks about God's eyes, that you are under or you are in our eyes. It talks about God's hands, that God's hands are outstretched. It talks about God establishing himself over the throne. Believe it or not, this verse caused a lot of violence amongst Muslims, or inter-sectarian, scuffles, you can say. So how do you interpret these verses? Well, let's look at how the Hanbalis, the first group, the Uber Orthodoxy, did. They said that we submit to these reports, even if we do not know their interpretation. We do not interpret them. So they affirm that God has a face, eyes, hands, legs, etc., and that he sits on the throne. They would add the disclaimer, however, bila kaif. This became the doctrine of bila kaif, that is, without howness, that is, amodally. That is, God has eyes, but we don't ask what these eyes are or how. God hears with his, God sees with his eyes, but we don't ask how he does that. So, and they would also say that that even though he has face, 2 eyes, 2 hands, 2 legs, they are not like, they would insist, the eyes of our eyes, our hands, our legs. So they would make this differentiation. Now their opponents would claim, and I'm of this, it feels like this to me as well, that these are just formal disclaimers. But if you listen, or if you read many of their descriptions, they do sound very anthropomorphic. For example, we can look at this Salafi or Wahhabi website, which is taking this Hanbali viewpoint. And it says that these divine attributes are to be affirmed in a literal sense, not metaphorical. And you see, for example, they affirm that God has 2 feet, and they believe that God takes his 2 feet and he kind of pushes down with them. It's very hard not to imagine in your mind that take these very literally. Now, of course, they would always add this disclaimer of bila kaif. But you even see that Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, he was attributed to have said that Adam was created in the image of God. So again, a lot more anthropomorphism here. At least that's what their opponents would accuse them of. Now, as far as the Kalam scholars, both Mu'tazilis and Asharis, they're both going to be really disturbed by this kind of language, and they're going to reject it. And they're going to say that we need to interpret all of these texts, or most of these texts, metaphorically. They accuse the Hanbalis of being anthropomorphists. And they took these verses of the Quran to be metaphorical, majazi, and they required tawil or interpretation. So they would say that this verse of the Quran, everything will perish save his face, they would take it as this is metonymy, which means that you're referring to someone by a part. The kind of crass example that I would give you is if I said to you, hey, you over there, get your butt over here. Butt over here refers to your whole self. It doesn't just refer to your butt, right? It means yourself, bring yourself here. The same way, the Quran is referring to God, his essence, that is what he is by this. It's rhetorical, basically. As far as God's eyes, this is metaphorical as well. It's saying that you are under God's providence, his providential vision. God is omniscient. His hands, it's again talking about God's providence, that God is not stingy. That's all it's talking about. He bestows his grace upon people. And finally, the verse of the throne is just metaphorical. It's speaking about God's profound power. There was, however, a debate between Mu'tazilis and Asharis on the beatific vision. I don't know if I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but it's about the idea of seeing God in the hereafter. So it's based on this verse of the Quran, That day faces will be radiant, gazing upon their Lord. And you see in Sahih Bukhari that it's actually quite literal. So someone asks God's messenger, shall we see our Lord on the day of resurrection? And the prophet is reported to have said, do you have any difficulty in seeing the sun and the moon when the sky is clear? And that God will come to them in a shape other than the one which they see him in the first time, because they see God before. And this form, this shape says, I am your Lord. And then people will say, no, you are not our Lord. And then God will reveal himself in his original image, and then they talk about God's shin. So they say that God uncovers his shin and everyone recognizes his shin and bows down to him. So God will then uncover his shin, whereupon every believer will prostrate before him. And that's in Sahih Bukhari. So now you see this debate that takes place between Islamic orthodoxy and the Islamic rationalists. And here as orthodoxy, I'm considering both the Hanbalis and the Asharis. And then they're at odds with the Mu'tazilis. The Hanbalis and the Asharis take this literally. The Hanbalis perhaps even more literally, that the people of paradise will see God with their eyes. And you see Imam al-Ashari saying, God will be seen by the eyes on the day of resurrection, as the moon is seen on the night when it is full. Meanwhile, the Mu'tazilis reject this and understand this Quranic verse metaphorically. It just means that the humans, the believers, will be pleased with their Lord, and their Lord will be pleased with them. Similarly, the Mu'tazilis will take metaphorical interpretations of verses and reports that they think are clearly not meant to be taken literally. For example, the idea of the scale, that on the day of judgment, your good deeds are going to be weighed against your bad deeds. This is metaphorical language, according to the Mu'tazilis, and should not be taken literally. Similarly, we've all heard that you cross the bridge that's razor thin, and you'll fall, on the one side is the hellfire, and you'll fall into it. That, in their viewpoint, these are clearly metaphorical images meant to kind of instill in you proper belief and practice. And these, by the way, are reported in the same hadiths about the vision of seeing God. So this is why the Mu'tazilis are saying it's completely reasonable to take these views, these ideas metaphorically. Of course, Islamic Orthodoxy, Hanbalis, and Asharis take these literally and believe that these are literal things that you will see and experience in the hereafter. And you'll see that these are mentioned again and again in the Islamic creeds. And I'll give you a book on Islamic creeds so you can go to the source yourself. Mu'tazilis believe these are to be taken as metaphors and symbols. Now, finally, we're going to talk about divine unity real quick. We only have a few minutes, so I have to run through this. Basically, Mu'tazilis, as Islamic rationalists, believe that God is absolutely simple. That is, he is not composed of parts. Therefore, God's attributes are not separate from his essence. Whereas the Asharis are going to say that God has attributes which are in addition to his essence. This is super confusing, I know. I'll leave this slide up, but we're going to make it more understandable by this debate, which I'm sure you are familiar with, is the debate over the Quran, whether the Quran is created or uncreated. The Hanbalis, that first group, argued that the Quran is uncreated, that it is eternal, pre-eternal with God. It is the speech of God and eternal. And so we see that there was even this right-wing view in early Islam that even the written page of the Quran, the verbal recitation of the Quran, all of that was uncreated. I didn't know why this view came about, but I asked Professor Khalid al-Wahib about it, and it seems to be that it was just this kind of deep respect for the Quran, that they didn't want to say that it was something that was created. Just as how some people say that the Prophet Muhammad was uncreated and pre-eternal, his essence, similarly. Now, the Mu'tazilis disagreed with this. They said, again, they were debating with Christians, and the Christians believe that Jesus was pre-eternal. He was the Word of God. He was the Logos. And that, so they have this verse in the Bible, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And they believe that if you're making anything pre-eternal with God, that's doing shirk. That's saying that there's something else along with God. So if we're criticizing the Christians for this, how can we believe the same thing about the Quran? And so the Mu'tazilis are going to argue that the Quran is created, and that saying otherwise is to impugn God's unity. Everything other than the creator is created, whether the prophet or the Quran. Now, this does not mean that the Mu'tazilis believe that the Quran is something that's fallible or has errors in it, etc. They believe that the Quran is the perfected word of God, but it is created just like the prophet is created. Now, the Mu'tazilis were in favor with the early Abbasid caliphs. Khalif al-Ma'mun, like many of the early Abbasid caliphs, was sympathetic to their views. He enforced the doctrine of the createdness of the Quran, starting with judges under his employ. He even punished, beat, and imprisoned, and sometimes even killed religious scholars who dissented. That is, the Hanbalis, who believed that the Quran was created, or uncreated, sorry. Imam Ahmad is the most famous example, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. He refuses to submit and was jailed, and he thereby became a hero of Islamic orthodoxy and of the masses. Now, the Mihna lasted, or the Inquisition, this is what it's called, the Quranic Inquisition, lasted for 15 years. It was reversed by a subsequent caliph, Khalif al-Mutawakkil. And the Mihna should be understood in the context of the first lecture we had as a failed attempt to reassert Khalifal authority against the religious clerics or the ulama. Now, Khalif al-Mutawakkil, he reversed the persecution. He publicly renounced the Mu'tazili doctrine and actually targeted Mu'tazilis, Islamic philosophers, Shias, and the people of the book, Jews and Christians. And so you see that there was actually violent persecution of the scholars. So you have this reverse persecution that started going on, and that honestly probably did not cease until now. And it should be kept in mind that even though we see Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal as a hero, and I think we should for his bravery and sticking to his viewpoint, whether we agree with it or not, I think it's worthwhile to point out that Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal himself and the Hanbalis in general, they also believe that anyone who believes in the createdness of the Quran is a kafir whose life is thereby forfeited. This view continues to this day, where saying that the Quran is created can get you in hot water, can cause you to get jailed, or you have to flee the country. So what about the Ash'aris? The Ash'aris took a middle way point. They publicly affirmed the belief in the uncreated nature of the Quran, and they would even criticize the Mu'tazilis. But privately, they actually said that the Quran, as we know it, is created. And so they would whisper that in their kind of circles. But they would say that there's something else called Kalam, which is divine speech, which subsists with God, and that is eternal and pre-eternal with God. So they did say, again, this private viewpoint in the classroom setting, that it is allowed to say that the Quran is created in a classroom setting. To me, it is quite unclear what this meaning of this pre-eternal speech or kalam is. And I've talked to many people about it. They've explained it to me in many different ways. I still kind of scratch my head. More importantly, it seems to me to be a sleight of hand to call it the Quran. So even if you say kalam of God is eternal, that's not the Quran. The Quran, as you say it, is created. So this seems to be a sleight of hand. And you can see Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, who kind of admits this, not in so many words, but he does kind of admit that there is a created aspect of the Quran, and you can see that viewpoint there, and he is an Ash'ari scholar. Now, this Quranic inquisition and then the reversal led to the fall of Mu'tazilism. Subsequently, Mu'tazili texts were burned, Mu'tazili scholars were banned from teaching, and the Mu'tazilis had to go underground. That's why we know so little about the Mu'tazilis. We get their viewpoints from their opponents, who are often very hostile to them. Islamic orthodoxy also wanted to portray them as being a marginal group of Islamic history. Western scholars took their viewpoints from this Islamic orthodoxy, and also this kind of tied in with Orientalist views, I argue, that reflect these long ingrained Orientalist biases, whereby anything spiritual, philosophical, or rational is to be distanced from Islam proper, which can only be viewed as legalistic, doctrinaire, and conservative. And this is kind of what I'm pushing back against in this class. So we see the rise of Mu'tazilism. It is the first theological school of Islam, founded by the third generation of Muslims, the Taba Tabayun, that is the Salaf. They were not, or the Taba Tabayun at least, they were not marginal, and were in fact a major school, at times the dominant one, at least amongst the ruling elite, for over 200 years of Islamic history. They ushered in the golden age of Islam, the 8th to the 13th century, under the Abbasids. This is when you had the Greco-Arab translation movement, where you translated all the Greek sciences and philosophy into Arabic. Now, keep in mind, it was not just translation. They were translating and also commenting on this and also building and improving upon it. So when the West will reclaim this during their Renaissance, they actually take the Arabic commentaries with them, because the commentaries are just as important as the original translations. So the Muslims are not just translating, they're actually actively engaging and improving the scientific endeavor. So you see here that there's the progress of science and philosophy. The Abbasids, the Caliph, the same one, Caliph al-Mamun, he establishes Bayt al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, which was like, you can think of it as a library where different scholars of all different religious faiths would gather and they would debate and they would explore scientific and philosophical topics. And Baghdad at this time became the capital of the world philosophically and scientifically. Lastly, I would keep in mind that the Mu'tazilis were observant Muslims, faithful to the Quran, who showed an openness to knowledge from the outside world, embracing reason at the same time believing in holding fast to revelation. As far as the causes of the fall of Mu'tazilism, number one was persecution by Islamic orthodoxy. The Mongol invasion and sack of Baghdad in 1258. This was the death knell. Basically, libraries were burned. And then you also had the rise and success of the competing Kalam school, Usherism. Basically, Usherism was taught in Islamic institutions, and they kind of took the wind out of the sails of the Mu'tazilis. By the end of the 13th century, Mu'tazilism was no longer an intellectual force in the world of Islam. It only survived in small or remote outposts. However, Mu'tazilism did survive at least partially in Shi'ism, as many of their ideas and metaethical frameworks were absorbed by Zaydi and Twelver Shias. But of course, it would be in the modern era, in the 19th century, when the Islamic modernist thinkers began to reclaim the legacy of the Mu'tazilis, turning this medieval school into a modern symbol. Here are some famous Mu'tazili scholars. Qadi Abdul Jabbar is the one that we saw his text here. Zamakhshari is a famous Quranic exegete. He has a very famous classical Quranic tafsir that is used by even Sunni Muslims in general. And keep in mind, by the way, Mu'tazilis were Sunnis. Nowadays, Sunni orthodoxy likes to exclude them from Sunnism and say Sunnism versus Mu'tazilism. But Mu'tazilis were Sunnis. Now, even some Western scholars, unfortunately, fall into this habit of excluding them from Sunnism. Finally, the authors of this book that I'll reference you, they basically see that this battle between rationalism and traditionalism has been present throughout the entire history of Islam. The Islamic traditionalists exert extraordinary influence through their ulama, the religious clerics, and they also find strong support from amongst the common masses, the awam. On the other hand, Islamic rationalism has always been limited to the intellectual elites. Finally, it's worth noting that both the Kalam schools believed in this thing called atomism, that the world is composed of atoms. I don't have time to go into detail of it, but basically they were taking the Greek Western science of their day, at least one version of it, and reconciling it with the Islamic religion. And we'll see that the Islamic philosophers will take this to this idea of taking reason and reconciling it with religion. They'll take it to its zenith. And we'll talk about the Islamic philosophers in the next class. Finally, this is the books that I recommend. Defenders of Reason in Islam. This is a really good book if you want to learn about the Mu'tazilis. The next book, Muslim Sects and Divisions, is kind of a heresiographical book of classical Islam. The Sunusi Creed is if you want to see a modern rendition of the Ash'ari Creed. There's a book on Islamic creeds that I strongly recommend. That's by Watt, Montgomery Watt has compiled them. And finally, if you want a kind of more introductory level book, I recommend Peter Adamson's book, Philosophy in the Islamic World. You can read the chapters on Mu'tazilism and Usherism, and even other chapters because it's quite interesting. And finally, Jim al-Khalili's book, which is also more of a popular book on the House of Wisdom and how in the Islamic golden age of science and philosophy. But we'll revisit that later. Here's kind of final last minute points, and then we're going to take questions. I'm sorry for going over time. Well, next class, we'll look at Islamic philosophy. Join the Google Classroom. upload video responses on the classroom, please. I still encourage you to do that. I haven't been able to do any deep dive videos. I apologize, just because this is so much work compiling these. And then again, send me the feedback there. Thank you so much, and let's take some questions. We'll go another 10 minutes or so. Okay, so do we have any verbal questions? Let's see, raise your hands, please. And in the meantime, I'll answer a, by the way, Imam Muhammad, our chaplain, congratulations on graduating with your master's. I was just notified that you did. That's a big deal.
It shouldn't be hard.
Alhamdulillah, thank you.
All day. I feel like I was running like 10 minutes late every day.
Sorry, is someone speaking right now? Okay. Raza, please go ahead, ask your question. Unmute yourself and ask.
I'll ask you to make some more historical kind of speculation here. So do you think that it's the social and political forces that give support to or are kind of responsible for which kind of creed takes over at a particular period of time or point of time in history? So for example, during the time of let's say Abbasids, when we had a big empire, we needed a more kind of concrete legal or theological kind of understanding or legal understanding of Islam, so that it could be implemented on across a wide empire. So those ideas took hold much more strongly at that time, and these days we have lost power, and the Western world is favoring more the Mutazilite ideology in a sense. So suddenly the space has now opened up, and it's almost these forces are pulling us in this direction. Again, I'm just asking you to make some speculation here.
Thank you so much. So I would say I agree that I would basically say that political context, historical, socio-political context is always tied to theology. I believe that these are so tied together that it's hard to extract them completely. One drives the other, and it's a dialectic, basically. They inform each other. So there's no way really to separate them. So we can't see these things as existing in vacuums. As far as what you said at the end, I would say that the encounter with the West has caused this resurgence in many different trends of Islamic thought. It has caused a resurgence in Hanbalism, for example, in addition to Mu'tazilism. And I would say that the West, we're going to have a whole lecture on this about Islamic modernism, but I do think that the Western Academy has become a refuge for many Islamic modernists, and the West in general, because in Muslim countries they're persecuted. So I do think that the West is opening these up. That may not necessarily be a negative thing. That's up to you. I do think that the Islamic Orthodoxy, they would like to portray it as all Western driven and even conspiratorial on that aspect. And there might be some truth to that, there might not be, but that's up to you to decide. All right, I'm gonna take one written question from Maz and Sana, and then I'm gonna go to Hassan Usmani after that. So the question is this: is there a historical context to justify the notion of the physical Quran and the celestial Quran that has been put forth by various scholars? Could this be what might be considered pre-eternal speech? I see what you're saying. Yes, there are people who would say that basically that there is this pre-eternal Quran that's different than our physical Quran here. And there are different views even what that means. So there's this idea of this preserved tablet. Is the Quran derived and all revelation derived from that preserved tablet? I do think that that is one way to justify it. But I don't think that necessarily gets you out of this dilemma. For me, I just want to, my point of view is, this seems very esoteric and an archaic debate, arcane debate. Why are we, bashing heads for this even to this day? You'll see Hanbalis and Asharis going to war on discussion forums on this issue. Doesn't seem very relevant to me, even though it is relevant as far as I think freedom of speech and freedom of religious thought is concerned. So that's my take on it. But thank you for that question. That's a good point. Mr. Hassan Usmani, please go ahead.
I was surprised at you're tying the allegorical interpretations of verses, etc., so closely to Mutazilites. I mean, all through my life growing up, I've always heard, allegorical interpretations of various verses or Quranic belief systems. in mainstream discussion, right? From what Son of God means to what Jahannam or heaven means to kind of God created in 6 days means, all those kinds of things. So,
Yes, thank you so much. And that's important to point out. So the Asharis who become Islamic Orthodoxy, they are believing that it's important to take these in a metaphorical way, just as the Mu'tazilis are. The Mu'tazilis go further in this direction, but the Asharis are also saying that we can't say God as face, eyes, hands. All of these things need to be understood allegorically or metaphorically. Mu'tazilis will take it further, and the Islamic philosophers will, some of them will take it even further than that. So that's why it is more of a mainstream opinion today not to take these things literally and not to have an anthropomorphic view of God. But we see that Hanbalism has resurged now with Salafi Wahhabism, and that is what now kind of makes this debate a live one today. All right. We can go another 5 minutes. Who needs to leave can leave. All right. Any other questions, verbal questions? All right, I have a couple more written questions that I can get into. One of them is, why did you mention FGM on your slide, female genital mutilation? That was very specific as far as I engage in, or I did a fellowship in medical ethics focusing on Islamic bioethics. I think my point was that these meta-ethical disputes about your framework, are things good because God says they are, or does God say they're good because they're good? They have a relevance when it comes to such issues as FGM. It has a relevance when it comes to debates about slavery, etc. That's why I bring up these debates, to kind of show you the relevance of this issue. It seems arcane and esoteric, but it really has quite a lot of relevance. All right, I have a question from Ali Raza. Morality is a big part of interfaith dialogues. If the Ash'aris believe in ethical subjectivism, how did they justify their ethical beliefs to non-Muslims? Well, like I said, they do believe in that God's habit will line up with human utility in most cases, and therefore, they would say that you can do this interfaith dialogue, and they did engage in it. YouTube. So there's a question from YouTube. Someone said, Abed said, theology is the systematic study of nature of the divine and more broadly of religious belief. Should we rephrase, quote, Quran is not a book of theology? So I'll say that in the academic sense of the word, theology refers to a specific discipline. In layman's terms, theology now, people just use it as synonymous with religious. So you could say any religious discussion is theological. That's kind of a layman's use of it, which is fine. I've done that myself before. And actually this confusion, when I first joined Harvard, I myself committed this. We're really talking about a specific discipline of Kalam, theology. And from that standpoint, I don't think the Quran is a book of theology. And on that point, I would actually have the Hanbalis to back me up. They would say that none of this Kalam is directly from the Quran. You can take the Quran and use it in Kalam, and there's no problem with that from my viewpoint. But to say that the Quran is not a book of law or a book of theology, I think that's pretty defensible. All right, that is it. So if that is it, we'll call it a day. Thank you so much, everyone. Any last questions? If not, we'll see you on Friday, where we're going to talk about Islamic philosophy. We're going to go deeper into this rabbit hole. All right, thank you so much.